随着中国迅速崛起，乌克兰战局持续升温，以及金砖国家联盟全球经济实力逐步增强，众多观点认为，我们正迈向全新的多极世界秩序，标志着美国主导和单极格局的时代逐渐逝去。那么，单极、多极和美国主导这些词汇究竟意味着什么呢？而如果我们正身处于新的多极世界秩序中，究竟会是混乱还是和平？我们的时代是否将迎来自由或压制？
I'm interviewing Amir Kiai, the policy coordinator for DM25, and I think that's a good place to start. DM25 stands for the Democracy in Europe movement for 2025, and it sounds almost like there's an implication that there's not yet democracy in Europe. Do you want to explain what DM25 is?
Yeah, sure. I can also maybe tackle, and hi everybody, and hi Henry. I can try to tackle a little bit that your subtext of that question, which is about democracy in Europe, and we see from our analysis that in a classic sense of power of the many, democracy, it doesn't exist in Europe in that sense, versus what our analysis shows to be an oligarchy, power of the few. And in this sense, it is actually built into the institutions of the European Union, and of course we're not just talking about the EU but the wider Europe. But even if we look at the primarily through the European Union mechanisms, I mean the European Parliament needs to co-legislate, it doesn't have right of full initiation itself. A lot of the power sits with quite some various committees within the EU mechanisms. There's over 140 different working groups, etc., made up of ministers and technocrats that are not really accountable to the wider public in that sense. I mean, if you use elections as a metric, if you like. So it's the institutional design of the European Union itself is prefers, let's say, oligopolistic, if you can use a business term. I know maybe for your speakers, for your audience, might make more sense in that sense. But yeah, so we definitely see that, and we've seen in terms of the big moments that have happened in Europe, of course, the war in Ukraine, etc., the refugee quote-unquote crisis, and so on. We often see that the decision-making is really happening in small circles without any real testing of those decisions with the public. So we don't see it as democratic. Using those limited terms, of course, I can expand on it if you wish. And so DM25 was founded in 2016. As in a way a response to the what you could see was a disintegration of even the little, let's say, political possibilities that exists in Europe in that sense, and we could see that unless the trajectory that the European Union is taking is very much towards even less and less of this, and it either has to democratize or it will disintegrate. And our analysis already has shown that with Brexit. Of course, and we can see there with the rapid rise of the more rightist views and alt-right backlash, etc. That's happened in Europe and so on. So that's where we sit, and the biggest way to address these concerns is not to channel more power into the hands of few, but to bring about more transparent and more democratic institutions, and that's the best weapon, if you like, against this.
And if you could briefly explain also how DM25 relates to the Progressive International and Mera 25, because I sort of understand you guys as sister cousin organizations, or?
Sure. I mean, DM25 was one of the co-founders of the Progressive International, and Progressive International has if you like, a more global remit. And it brings together movements and organizations and parties and progressive forces throughout the world to really realign global politics. So that's, if you like, the Progressive International in that sense. And then our movement, DM25, besides its movement work, and when I say movement work, I'm talking about campaigning, petitioning, protesting, and so on, the typical, let's say, social actions that we would do from outside, if you like, the framework of power. we also realize the progress of humanity in terms of having elections and still representative democracy, etc. And we also provide the alternative for the public, if they choose to vote for policies that the movement is setting. And those are the Merit 25s. So our political parties are called Merit 25, and they are contesting elections where we have them. And those are in Greece, Germany, and Italy. For the moment, of course, we're looking to expand it.
And so then I guess we'll get into the topic of my series, which is about multipolarity, right? A lot of viewers in China are now describing this time that we're living as multipolar, or we're moving towards shifting poles of power. Do you buy into this idea that we're in a new multipolar world? Do you think that's a fair term, or?
It might be partially a desire to move into a multipolar world, and that would probably be, let's say, politically and hegemonically speaking, better in terms of, the worst of the evils. If we sort of still maintain the sort of big power structures globally, then a multipolar world would be much more helpful in terms of what we are seeing right now globally, in terms of the global crises and confluence of conflicts, etc. At the same time, we also see that in reaction towards moving towards a potentially peaceful multipolar world, we also see the hegemonic powers coalescing as much as possible, and we have had in our grassroots position making and policy making, we've had some discussions about this as well internally in movement, and we see that there's that potential for it to go to the multipolar world, but we also see it progressing into possibly a bipolar world again, and Europe being, dragged along with the United States, and which is not what we would like to see. We would like to see a non-aligned Europe, politically speaking, being a force for good for the world.
So I guess this is a great point to bring up. I've seen that Yanni Varoufakis has tweeted about leaving NATO, and you retweeted him. So is that part of this policy to try to move out of the alignment of, or this sphere of influence, I guess, of America?
You see, the question about NATO is a fundamental one. And, when we talk about non-alignment, and political non-alignment also means military non-alignment, economical non-alignment, we suddenly, this is a concern for us, because the moment, we've seen the pivot to Asia under Obama, and then the increase on trade attacks, let's say, with China, etc. And then suddenly in the German annual security strategy process, China became a country of concern, or whatever term is being used in Germany right now. And it's not true. I mean, there's no, we didn't feel any differently, and I live in the Netherlands, about this. So we are in a sense forced to follow the lead of the United States, because we are not independent of the policies made in Washington, D.C. So, and that NATO is a part of that, of course, and it's that perceived defensive benefit of being in NATO, and the relatively, let's say, smaller armies and navies and the military of Europe, means that there's a perceived, again, dependency on the United States, and so we follow that along. So that NATO is part of that architecture, and for us to be independent, it means we have to move out of NATO.
So then, does that also mean that you want to retreat from the war in Ukraine, or maybe retreat is not a good word, but would you like Europe provide less support to Ukraine, or be more active, for example, in ending the war, I guess, is also part of that policy idea?
Look, it definitely is that we can't be sitting in a war, whether it's in Europe or anywhere else for that matter. And there's also other wars, luckily less so compared to a few decades ago on the planet. However, if there is a conflict at this stage, we should be doing everything possible to end it and not further it. There's, of course, the legitimate right of self-defense that we shouldn't forget about. That does exist in international law. However, we can't continuously fuel it, and on the other side, avoid any shuttle diplomacy, avoid any moves towards peace, avoid censoring any voices for peace. And this was, this happens quite frequently, unfortunately, in Europe. The moment, there's a, trying to position a narrative around no to war, and also no to occupation, and no to annexation of Ukrainian territory. You either get blamed as a Putin supporter, or you get, you blamed as the other way around, as a, pro-war position. It's quite hard in Europe to move towards peace, unfortunately, for the moment. And maybe once the circumstances change come November next year in the United States, we might see that change, of course.
Also, you're saying that it isn't necessarily a grassroots-based sentiment, that it's sort of almost top-down about regulating how people speak about the war, rather than,
there's the huge, the fact that, we can debate the quality of Russian media, but the immediate shutting down of any kind of broadcast coming into the European IP range, for example, is a problem in that sense, because now, of course, people can access RT, etc., if they are willing to, but this shutting down of perspective, even though, we know that it's state propaganda, and of course, they're going to push the argument for why the war should continue from a Russian point of view, but we should assume people are intelligent enough to understand that, instead of, cutting it off.
Google has barred Russia's state-owned media outlet and other channels from receiving money for advertisements on their websites, apps, and YouTube videos. Google has further banned downloads of Russian state-owned media outlet RT's mobile app on Ukrainian territory.
So that's just on the media side.
Right. Well, I am interested in the media thing, the media side of things, given where I work, I guess.
Exactly.
So then if you would like to pivot over to the refugee issue, which you did bring up earlier as well, it seems for a while that the media portrayal about the refugee crisis in Europe is that the more refugees are hosted, or asylum seekers are hosted in Europe, the more alt-right backlash there will be. Is this a fallacy that the media has created? Do you think there's a natural response to hosting refugees? Is there a gut reaction against multiculturalism in Europe?
It's a very good question, and luckily we can actually show examples, because again, with Ukrainian refugees, the European legal system, financial system, housing system worked incredibly well, rightly so. We in our house ourselves hosted 3 refugees from Ukraine, and we could see how the system responded really as fast as possible to hosting the right kind of refugee. At the same time, we are willing to see the continuous death in the Mediterranean and in the Channel Islands, etc., of refugees trying to cross. We had 700 people drown in one incident. And what's sad about this incident is that there were, Frontex equipment, helicopters, Greek Navy ships, etc., all around. And we let 700 people drown. And this points to the reality of how policy is made on refugees in Europe, in terms of an actual acute response. Now, we also have to go further back. We have to go and look at the root causes of the refugee crisis. It didn't just happen overnight. Of the global, 108 million refugees now, according to UNHCR, etc., 60 to 70% came as a result of the war on terror. The wars in the Middle East for the past few decades have created a lot of refugees. The bombing of Libya, has created a lot of refugees, and also created a channel for refugees and so on. So these refugees aren't just here because, it's a better life and they just happen to wake up and they want to come. No, Europe has a very significant role by supporting, again, NATO policies, American policies, etc., has a significant role to play in the causes of migration. We've also been supporting dictatorships where people are fleeing from. Europe has been a strong supporter of its former colonies when they ruled by dictators and so on. We see this in Egypt, military coup d'etat we still supported. We see this now in Tunisia, where the Dutch prime minister actually went to visit recently and signed a deal, etc. So Europe is very much part of creating the problem politically. To your question about the role of the media doesn't actually address the root causes. Doesn't say, we actually bombed these countries and this is the consequence of it, and we are responsible. So that link is not made at all for the minds of the public. And the public is not necessarily always aware, of course, of all the military adventures that Europe is involved in. I mean, as even with Niger, there were Italian, German, and besides the French troops that everyone knows, there's also a contingent of Italian troops. Now, what are Italians doing in Niger? Nobody knows, and so on. So this is a problem. And I also just wanted to a little bit touch on what we talked on a little bit before, and it's not just moving away from NATO, as I wanted to mention, but also moving away from this idea of military blocs and militarization, etc. And we really have to sort of think broadly and talk and see it in a whole system point of view, because it's the 21st century. Every part of the world is connected. We can't continue thinking that, by pummeling a country, we're going to gain and they're going to lose. No, everybody loses. We have bigger challenges of climate change, etc., etc. We have to cooperate on. And then if you remove people from the table, we can't cooperate with them. So these are very important issues for this century. We can't use, 17th century thinking to solve our problems.
And so I'm hearing you say we don't want to align with someone else. There should be an independent and generally peaceful multicultural unit of Europe. That's the vision for DM25.
Of course, yeah, sure. And this is a where Europe works with its neighboring regions, works with the Mediterranean countries, the Middle East. Yeah, Europe still has a lot of historical involvement with that part in terms of what it's done with the former colonies. And I'm using the former because there are sometimes still existing colonies. And Macron was saying that they're a South American power because because of French Guiana. It's very far from France when I look at the map, right? So we have to, really realize that, we can continue serving, if you like, the will to power, or we can continue serving the will to good at a more philosophical level. But maybe that's,
And it's good that we've sort of arrived at the French troop presence in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, because there's been the wave of coups, and increasingly it seems like whether or not there is a coherent movement in Europe that's actively trying to position Europe more fairly on the global stage, that there's almost a new wave of decolonizing forces and whatnot. But it also seems that they're leaning into the Wagner mercenary enforcement in those areas to fight the Sahel insurgency. So is it just a sign of Europe's wane on the global power politics, as cynical as that is as a framework, or or is it actually a legitimate decolonizing force, do you think?
Well, there's definitely within the public, there's that feeling of the need. And I mean, not that I can speak on behalf of the people of the Sahel, of course, as you can imagine, it would be inappropriate as someone who's based in Europe. However, there is definitely from what we can see, a genuine feeling of letting go of the shackles of colonialism. We also see that not just in Sahel, we see it in South Africa, for example, where because during the apartheid negotiations, the political power did move hands, but the economic power did not. And the country is still paying the price for that. And there is an increasing movement that wants to expropriate factories, farms, etc., that belong to Europeans, if you will, in that sense. So this unfairness that exists, whether it's in trade, whether it's in relations, whether it's even with humanity, again, we see this with the refugees, right? So certain refugees are allowed in, certain ones are not. The famous, Joseph Borrell's thing about the garden, etc. These, at that level of the dehumanization, that's, I mean, if we put ourselves in the feet of somebody who's living in Mali, we would also feel that. And we would also want to be free from that. So this is it's a real thing. So you touched on Wagner, you touched on other groups, and you will see that this is happening. This will happen because there's a vacuum now, and those forces that are working against, the one side will exploit it and will promote their own interest. And that's again also unfortunate, because at the end of the day, the public might not actually realize its, let's say, dream of a free Sahel, for example, in that sense.
I guess if you're ready to, I can ask you the big questions. Do you think that the proletariat or the precariat of the world will benefit from a shifting of power or a more even distribution of it, multiple poles?
The precariat will benefit if the power actually comes to them. If the poles might shift, and as a result of that, we might see maybe less global conflict because of the multipolarity. Naturally, if one were to apply a international relations framework to all of this, theoretically. However, the precariat, the miners in the Congo that have to mine cobalt with their hands for the iPhones, their life is not going to change if it's a multipolar, or unipolar, or bipolar. And that's maybe the lens we have to look at it from that point of view. So the moving of the poles might maybe create more space for movements like us, for example, for progressive forces to maybe reach the public better, and so on and so forth. So that might help us in that, from that point of view. But as long as the power, whoever hands it is in, as long as it's in the hands of the few, the precariat will continue to suffer.
So that was, I guess, I had a slight question inside of that question, is the idea that now that we may be shifting towards multipolar power structure, if those power structures are still organized in a elitist or oligarchical or monopolistic way, the likelihood is that the proletariat, precariat will not see that devolution of power down to them. Do you think there's a chance for them to seize it, though?
Well, the seizing of power is a big issue. It depends, it's a big question in that sense, right? I mean, it comes down to sometimes being able to first see the alternative, and in DiEM25, we often talk about, one of our challenges that we try to overcome is what's called TINA, right? From Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative. The concept that there's no alternative, that this is the neoliberal economies, etc. The way things are is the way they are, and there's no way to alter them. That actually is a huge obstacle, because as you can understand, people will not participate in something when there's no hope to achieve anything. And so, if these moments of if the shift creates a huge amount of crises, and crisis is when people realize that, as I think, and I can't remember now who I'm quoting, but it was something like this: a society is always 3 meals away from a revolution, in that sense. So if there's a huge crisis, mass unemployment, etc., it might be, we might see that in a classical way of seizing power, as you're pointing out. But look, whoever is on the other side, of course, knows this, and they construct policies around it. So we're unlikely to see this. If you will, in your country, in the United States, I don't know how many people die of fentanyl overdose every day. The opioid crisis by the Sackler pharmaceuticals, I think, costed 500,000 lives. I'm not sure if I'm using the right numbers, but thousands of people, families, the homelessness in San Francisco, etc. It's very visible that there's a crisis going on. And we're not necessarily seeing like rising up to the extent that you might see, for example, with the pipeline, etc., that happened. There's some pockets of resistance, but we're not really necessarily seeing like in this example of the United States, or where people like saying enough is enough and we want to do it. We see it more in, with Chile, for example, and the more peaceful revolutions and transformation of power, etc. We sometimes see it, and those are the beacons of light, for us in that sense. But it's a mixed bag answer I'm giving you, I know.
I guess in America, it seems like I think in the first Republican debate, they were talking about how since Biden was in office, there have been 200,000 deaths of fentanyl, but it makes it seem like it's his fault personally, which is funny, right? Like,
it's a crisis,
it's obviously a systemic policy failure.
It's a huge problem, and if the Pentagon spending is $800 billion plus more, and if the policing budget in the United States is around 250-300 billion, it's a huge amount of money that is actually not going to healthcare, that is not going to dealing with the mental health issues that makes people go towards narcotics, etc. as well. So it's not dealing with the root cause. And this model of let's keep the problems going because it's profitable is mad. It's the same with climate change. Let's wait until Shell has, found a way to decarbonize and then let them continue having the business. We're not really looking at, treating it as an emergency in that sense, So it's just everything becomes business at the end of the day. And that's really unfortunate, for a species that's come this far.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought up climate change. Do you see that a shift in poles and power will have any positive impacts on the climate change? Or, I mean, there are also the climate pessimists that see this as an era where everyone's just racing to get the last oil, coal, natural reserves that exist. I guess that's a very vague question.
No, well, I mean, it's a good question because we can theorize about it, but we can look at the reality. The biggest delegation at the COP conferences has been the lobbyists for the energy companies. That should tell you, who runs the show, and where the attention and energy is going to, literally. Well, in that sense, so we don't see that. But again, it will be important for us and maybe for progressive forces, and we do this to look at the shifting situation, especially, of course, with the BRICS expansion, etc. To look at the shifting situation, and we just have to use it in terms of strategy, as I mentioned earlier on, for trying to reverse the lemming-like movement that we are as humanity towards the cliff.
Well, would you like to plug DM25 Progressive International? Is there a shot for Americans to start their own chapters? So that we might.
I mean, we have members in the United States, we have members on the African continent, in Asia, etc. So membership is open to any person who reads our manifesto and is aligned with our viewpoints, etc. So there's not a problem. So people can go to dm25.org and have a look and support us if that resonates with them. And I think one of the important reasons sometimes I am part of this is because we are actually trying to build the alternative, literally, whether it's from a policy point of view, from a campaigning point of view, also creating democratic mechanisms amongst people to decide and deliberate and take it from there. So yeah, of course, it would be great.